My name is Abdullahi, and our guest today is Dr. Guyo. Dr. Guyo, welcome to The Elephant.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, today we will be talking about drought and some ways of mitigating in the northern parts of Kenya. I want to start with Dr. Guyo. The frequency of droughts have increased in northern Kenya. Between 1960 and 2016, we recorded 15 droughts. And 1970s and 80s were practically called the decades of droughts. What do you think is behind this?
Thank you, Abdullahi. Thank you for the good question. I think this is a consistent or persistent question that everybody who is in this drought management, drought intervention cycle have been grappling with. So I think precisely to answer your question, there are two reasons why this is happening. The first one is the natural causes, what in science we call it global warming. So over the years, when you look at the trend of the shift in annual temperature, it has been increasing while the annual precipitation has been decreasing. So just to help you slightly understand what I'm talking about, this shift, between 1880 to almost 1980, the global temperature has been increasing at an average rate of 0.08 degrees per decade. But then if you look at the last 40 years, since 1981, it has doubled. So it's increasing by 0.18 degrees. And if you look at quite closely at the science, 2020 was declared the year of the hottest year, the second hottest year, I think, on Earth. And this predictably tells you how the natural processes have been shifting. And basically, drought is a balance between evaporation and transpiration. So with the shift in temperature, definitely, and reducing annual precipitation, the frequency is increasing because we break both regional and global hydrological cycles. So once that cycle is broken, then now predictability becomes difficult, the severity changes, many things changes. So that's the first reason why you see the last 40, 50 years as a decade of drought. The second is what commonly in science we call anthropogenic drought. Anthropogenic droughts are droughts which are actually human-induced from human activities. And this is basically, you can, if you look at the recent changes, how do we break, the hydrological cycle? How do we destroy our catchment? How do we induce, deforestation? The land use change, the intensity of, food production, energy production, the emission in greenhouse gases from our industrial activities, because basically this drought we call anthropogenic drought is from our human footprint, and so the combination of the human footprint now translates into the global change, and that global change is actually basically why our activities have been intensively changing over the years. Human population has been increasing, and so as a result, you see the last decade, as you call it, decade of drought in the last 40, 50 years.
Thank you, Dr. Guyo. But over the years, despite having this sort of knowledge or understanding all the data, there has not been, the way we deal with drought, at least at the national level, is largely reactionary. But you're saying that with all this data, there are more sustainable ways of dealing with drought. Do you want to speak about that? The reactionary part, as well as a more sustainable, rounded way of addressing drought and its impact?
This particular statement varies from country to country. I think largely, quite a number of African countries are in the reactionary intervention approach. And I think before we come to what are the sustainable approach to drought management, I want to explain to you a little bit about the gaps that explain the reactionary thing. In a number of drought-prone countries, including Kenya, we have a system for early warnings in place. But then how that early warning translates from centralized system for documenting, collecting information to the intervention is quite a big challenge up to now. So we send early warning without necessarily having quite a number of sustainable programs in place, project funding mechanism to respond to droughts. So what I'm basically saying is that the gap between when the early warning information are sent and the time we intervene, there's a huge gap. And that gap actually is one of the biggest problems. The second challenge is also our drought management plans have what we call shelf projects. These are pre-planned projects when we trigger early warning that will respond to drought. Unfortunately, we don't have sustainable funding mechanism linked to this project. So we have clean projects listed, but then we haven't thought, how do we pick some of this project along the drought phases? Because the drought phases move, from the warning alert, up to what they call recovery. So it's a very systematic phases that you can quickly follow and then have shelf project that responds to these cycles. So we don't have that. The second, I think, which I also spoke to, is our response mechanism is very haphazard and also scattered. That's why you have humanitarian intervention. You have all these actors who are coming at the tail end when drought has actually turned into a disaster. So our intervention should have actually come before this transition from drought being potentially a risk to a crisis. So a lot of money is used at the crisis phase. We would have actually avoided if you put our money at the risk phase. You could actually reduce this risk. So these are some of the gaps that we actually need to grapple with as we design our system. So I think for us to go from this to a more sustainable approach, we need to invest in a very good system. So we need to galvanize our resources, effort, conversation on how do we have a good system in place. A good system is as good as the data you put in. So that speaks to our data. How much scientific data do we put into our system? The second is how much local indigenous knowledge do we integrate into this system? So all these things are continuous conversation, but I don't think we are progressing systematically to integrate that. So for us to have a sustainable approach, we need to fix all these gaps, gaps in translating information, early warning into action, a gap that make actualization through requisite funding. And I think, I don't know whether the bill in place has been passed in Kenya, the National Drought Management Fund has been put in place. This fund, the logic is that I think this is the way you can draw down into, is a funding mechanism that doesn't have a lot of bureaucratic processes to be drawn into. So when you reach certain point, it should have minimal restriction in terms of how quickly you can access, how little bureaucratic process should be in place, so that you access this funding to respond to some of these things timely. So, and then I think the system has to change. I think we need to have a portal. We'll speak to that, I think, at some point, but I think we need to have a portal in place that has a spatial view, an interactive map, which shows spatial extent, severity, in a very timely way that is linked with narrative on the drought per different region, per county, and etc. Currently, we don't have that. We have hard data that we collect through bulletin every month, and then that bulletin remains on, I think, NDMA page for Kenya, and I think that has to move. So the good news is that we have the formative information and the foundation to move this thing forward. We need to put a lot of investment in our early warning systems and our response mechanism to be in tandem with the drought cycles as it moves from, alert, warning to, to recovery.
You've touched on something that I wanted us to speak to, and that is the question of data. How it's collected, how it's stored, how it's managed, and how it's shared, and therefore used. Do you think, do you want to go into a bit of a detail on how that is currently done and what could be done for it to be more decentralized, for it to be more action-based, for it not just hard data that sits on the national, drought authorities portal?
Yeah, thank you. I think currently the NDMA, which is the authority that manages our drought and crisis related to drought, has what we call a monthly drought monitoring bulletin. This bulletin has a number of information. The first one is the rainfall performance and the forecast. The second, I think, using what they call the vegetation index, vegetation condition index, they look at the vegetation, the browse quality, the pasture quality, and then they also collect information on animal body condition, animal mortality, other related food price movement, and I think land cover change. So they have a number of information there. What they do, I think, at the end of the bulletin, they put the phase in which the drought is right now in every given month. And then they also put what I call the shelf projects that should go on at this particular moment. And the gap, of course, as I said earlier, is that the funding mechanism on this shelf project is still not well thought through. So we have that in place. I think they also do what they call food security assessment survey, which they do extensively, collecting data from different points within different counties, and then compile it into one, into one map, into one narrative, a huge report that largely takes, I think, a month or plus to compile. So you can imagine you are collecting data for a drought, which is a shifting thing. By the time you finish compiling your data, the drought phase has shifted. So I think, as I said earlier, is we need to have a very good portal. A good example, I think in Canada, they have a portal for drought monitoring, which is a monthly interactive visual with narrative and potential intervention plugged into. So anybody who want to look at, let's say, a county like Kitui, Wajir, Mandera, you just go click there, click, and then you go to the sub-county and look at the picture. What is the spatial extent of drought? What is the severity within the county? What are the spatial spread of the drought? So, and then you can also do inter-county comparison, especially for the connected, hydrological, what they call it, we call it ecological boundaries that are connected. So we need to invest in that. I think we can also bring in, indigenous knowledge into this thing. There are quite a number of good indigenous knowledge which is still alive and working, but I think we completely disregarded them. We've just invested in hydrological, what do you call it, meteorological data. So this can be developed, and then I think we can pilot them, see how do we work on the gaps I mentioned earlier, on how do we actually give this early warning in a very systematic way, and anybody who want to invest can invest strategically, not opportunistically, strategically at the right stage with the data availed. So we need to actually invest a lot into a system that collects the good quality data, avail it in a form that is useful, and then can be utilized, can be used for planning purposes. So I think we, as I said, we have the initial foundation. It's just a question of how do we, structure it and move forward. Thank you.
While you're talking there, something jumped out at me about, how centralized, some of this information is, right? So how is it currently done? Is there an opportunity for it to be decentralized? You mentioned about, if this data is collected and it can be seen, let's say I generally do not do a humanitarian emergency, I do something to do with pastoralism. At what point can I intervene based on my comparative advantage, knowledge, and everything? Is there an opportunity? How is currently, the data collected? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? Are there opportunities of plugging in and be able to enhance that process?
Thank you. I think the way the data is compiled is from the county level, building it into a national, portal, which is, I think, the report in the portal for NDMA. So they collect data every other month. I think they have a phases for data collection, compiling it, and timely submitting into the portal. So if you click right now NDMA portal, you see all the months monthly bulletin. This bulletin serves for a warning of anybody who want to have, look at the status of drought in different county. That is the best so far it can do. So definitely we can improve. I think the local level, county level should not just only provide the data or have an office, decentralized office, which currently NDMA in every county has an office that oversee that particular important exercise. It should, I think, move beyond that, because county right now has a resource. So we should be able to link that and fix the problem I mentioned earlier in the shelf projects that is listed there. How do we link it to the county funding? so that the money don't go through the office of the governor as it currently does to take care of the current crisis, to a more systematically linked intervention. So that is one. And I think the other thing is also at the local level, the offices like NDMA, which are decentralized, should be provided with requisite resources and technologies to do their job. I think currently they're just administrative, oversee all the things on food distribution in the past, but right now they are preparatory work on data collection, submission, and making sure that everything is sent to the national or centralized system. So we can improve that. The second one, I think in some of the counties, they have quite moved very fast in terms of legislation. So I think few counties like Makueni, and I think, I don't know whether 3 or 4 right now, they have what they call climate change financing bill. This bill actually allocate or apportion 2% of the overall budget to climate change interventions. And I think that is the very good entry point in terms of how do you mainstream climate intervention, not in a reactionary way, but in a sustainable development lens. So counties have exceptional roles to play, but we just need to configure out how do we bring in or integrate county structure within the intervention that currently is in place. Certainly there's room for that. And I mentioned, I think, around legislation, around aligning resources into the right activities and making sure that everything is well linked so that you don't have an actor who just jumps in and do their own things in a very isolated way.
Yeah, when the media comes in, everybody wants to be where the action is. And finally, pastoralist communities have got their own indigenous ways of dealing and mitigating, adapting to the climatic shocks, because, more than any other group, their lives and livelihood are tied to the climatic cycles or weather cycles. Are there opportunities, are there means of how some of these things can be incorporated, particularly at the county level, in terms of intervention mechanism, or they've just been put aside and we are all chasing the new shiny toys in town?
Yeah, I think, this is an interesting question. I think many of us have overlooked this particular aspect in terms of how much do we pull from our existing indigenous knowledge to build a system that is responsive to this. One time, I think when we were in Merti or somewhere, in Merti in Isiolo, an elder actually asked us a very interesting question. We're having a conversation on land governance and etc., but then there are also people who are discussing drought intervention and etc. So, and is at the peak of the drought. So this elder said something very interesting. He said, the problem with you guys is that you also come when the vultures are coming. And he said it's very difficult to distinguish you from the vulture because of the timing. So he said them through their indigenous systems, they have actually a quite good warning that this season will not be very good. And definitely he mentioned a few things that actually says this is how the season will look like, around looking at how, interpretation of the intestine of animals. There are many things people use, behavioral change in birds, behavioral change in wild animals, and etc. These are things that they also use. But I don't think any one of us have, in this drought management processes, have established a good footing on how do we bring any other that is going to build our system to a sort of climate-proof system. We haven't done that, and I'm very sure there's a scope for that. It's just that the question of how do you bring these institutions into this, and have how do you improve the scientific processes that we use for predicting data, drought, interpreting data for drought situations, and eventually how do we go into intervention. So yeah, I think there's a scope, but then we are doing very little right now in that regard.
Thank you so much. I think that is that is very insightful, Dr. Guyo. We'll leave it at that for today, and hopefully we'll have another chance to be able to catch up with you. Thank you, Dr. Guyo.
Thank you so much, Abdullah, for having me, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.